again, last night I had a chance to sit down with some members of the NCTTP Executive Committee that I haven't seen face-to-face in a long time, and just that warmth, that human connection, and it's just so important for us to be gathering here today. A couple days ago, a very dear colleague, actually my better half, was celebrating a birthday, and you know, there's been a lot going on in the world. I don't know if you've noticed. But it was one of those moments like, do we really want to celebrate? We want to be out there. There's a lot happening with the family. There's a lot happening professionally. There's this, there's that. But then she sat down and she made a toast to those who were gathered. And it really moved me in the sense of just how blessed she was feeling. How blessed we are to have this community, to have one another to lean on in dark times. I salute our colleagues in Minnesota, our colleagues in Chicago, in Portland, in the Carolinas, those in the quote-unquote frontline states, San Diego, who's seeing more people pass through than anywhere else in the country, Texas, Austin, that has the largest homeless shelter dealing with immigrant population everywhere, oversaturated, overstressed, undersupported, perhaps even vilified at times. We need this community now more than ever. We need a meeting like this. And when we look at, the intergenerational trauma and healing, it's that duality. They aren't contradictory terms. They're things that work together, trauma and healing, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today from the standpoint of healers, from the standpoint of survivors, because we are all in both of those categories at this point. But so let's get things started. I'm going to start with an amazing opportunity to welcome truly a star, a shining star in our field, Dr. Vincent Iacopino, who has spent more than 2 decades at PHR. I was looking at all the different countries where he has served, and the list is alphabetical, and I was just trying to pick out the letters that aren't represented, because it's from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe and so many different spots in between, Sierra Leone, Burma, Kyrgyzstan, you name it. He is now at the University of Minnesota Medical School. He helped to found and direct the Survivors International program in the Bay Area, Northern California. He is one of the driving forces behind the Istanbul Protocol that Dr. Quiroga was just speaking about. He's written more than 120 papers and all that. Who better to come give an overview, not only of where we've been, where we've come from, where we are, and where we hope to go. I can't wait to hear from Dr. Iacopino, so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to welcome him to the stage. Please, sir.
Well, good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for that kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here with you, and I am very humbled to have this opportunity to talk to you about my experiences in combating torture over the past 35 plus years. I hope that my reflections will provide some insight into the progress that we've achieved and an understanding of the challenges that lie ahead. So, like many of you, I did not seek out anti-torture work way back in those days. It found me. And my perspectives on combating torture are rooted in a much larger context, that of protecting and promoting human rights and the dignity of all people. There we go. Well, my perspective began right here at Georgetown in 1979. I was a PhD student working on the cardiovascular mechanisms of anaphylaxis and a medical student acquiring the knowledge and skills to diagnose and treat physical and mental diseases. It was during the Cold War. We lived under the constant threat of nuclear war. Human rights discourse was in its infancy. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was just 31 years old, and subsequent international covenants on civil and political rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights had entered into force just 3 years prior. There was no UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, UN Convention Against Torture, UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, or UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. No Women's Convention, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Equal Rights Amendment had just failed in Congress. The World Health Organization's definition of health, which included physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, was just a one-year-old baby. So I should also say that there was no concept of social determinants of health, discourse on global health, recognition of the linkages between health and human rights at that time. I mention this not only as relevant context for my perspectives on torture, but as an explanation for 10 years of conceptual wandering that ultimately took shape only through serendipity and profound life experiences, which I'm about to discuss. So during my last year of medical school here at Georgetown in 1985, I spent 2 months working in a Cambodian refugee camp and another year during my internal medicine residency at the University of Minnesota. The experience of providing medical care in an active war zone in the aftermath of genocide and in the context of a chronic humanitarian disaster changed my life and career trajectory. As you may know, Cambodia was devastated by the Vietnam War, 400,000 civilian casualties from secret U.S. bombings, which destabilized the country and enabled the Khmer Rouge to take power. Between 1 and 2 million Cambodians died from starvation, disease, and executions. And in 1979, hundreds of thousands fled to the Thai border when the Vietnamese forces assumed control in the country. The Thai government used the refugees as a human buffer between the Vietnamese-backed forces in Cambodia and the Thai people, intentionally exposing refugees to ongoing war and enforcing austere camp conditions to discourage further refugee flows. Although I was part of an enlightened effort by the American Refugee Committee to train health workers, nurses, and medics to be self-sufficient, I came to realize that medical care did little to address the causes of people suffering: ongoing war, attacks by Thai security forces, effective imprisonment, no electricity, clean water, sanitation, or hope of resettlement in a third country. Every night, the refugees would go to sleep to the sounds of gunfire and shelling with their belongings packed in anticipation of the next evacuation. That's what they cared about. I learned that my knowledge and skills was largely irrelevant in addressing the causes of suffering that I witnessed, and my location, downstream, at the bedside, limited my ability to take effective action. For example, in the case of landmine injuries, we amputated limbs and provided prosthetics and rehabilitation, but this did nothing to prevent others from suffering the devastating consequences of landmines. As a physician, I knew that I had to do more, but the path was not yet clear. We also failed to address the mental health effects of past and ongoing trauma among the refugees, or deal with our own unanticipated emotional reactions to witnessing the after effects of genocide, profound losses, and ongoing exposure to war and disease. As you may know, the vicarious trauma was not formally recognized until 1990. There was one day more than any other that fueled my lifelong journey and human rights perspective. While making rounds on the adult medicine ward with my Cambodian medics, mortar shells suddenly landed in camp, a condition that automatically triggered the evacuation of all relief workers. Leaving my friends behind left permanent emotional scars of betrayal and guilt that I was not yet prepared to deal with. It propelled me, however, to seek an understanding of fundamental causes of human suffering and never to be a silent witness to inhumanity. Just before graduating from Georgetown Medical School, I had the great fortune of hearing Dr. Jack Geiger speak on behalf of Physicians for Social Responsibility about the health consequences of nuclear war in a conference room much like this. Jack was a giant in the field of public health, a leader in social medicine, and a founding member of 2 Nobel Peace Prize winning organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility and Physicians for Human Rights. He started the community health center movement in the United States that inspired a national network of more than 1,000 clinics that currently serve 28 million low-income patients. When Jack examined malnourished children, he famously wrote prescriptions for food. Jack's message that day at Georgetown was simple and instructive for me. The only rational medical response to the prospect of nuclear war is prevention. I realized then that I needed to work upstream, away from the bedside, to prevent the suffering that I witnessed in the Cambodian refugee camps. Little did I know at that time that Jack would become my mentor at PHR and a lifelong friend. Again, serendipity. Fortuitously, when I resumed my internal medicine residency at the University of Minnesota, one of my attendings was Dr. Neil Holton. Neil had worked in the same refugee camp that I had just returned from, and he was also the medical director at the Center for Victims of Torture in Minneapolis, which had just opened its doors and Healing Garden just 2 years earlier. I'm not sure why, but he invited me to sit in on several clinical encounters with survivors. It was my first exposure to the practice of healing and restoring dignity among survivors in the wake of extraordinary trauma. These humanitarian assistance experiences and exposure to survivors of torture became the impetus for a 2-year postdoctoral research project on human suffering that I undertook at the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program at Stanford University and the University of California, San Francisco. Before starting my research at Stanford, I worked in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, a place where evil spirits were considered the primary cause of human suffering. For example, this man presented to our hospital after a traditional healer performed a bush thoracotomy, the practice of instilling unsterile water into the chest cavity and observing pus as a confirmation of an evil spirit cast upon an individual by another person. For me, such dramatic health practices underscored the relationship between our understanding of the causes of human suffering and health practice. When evil spirits are thought to be the cause of people's suffering, health practice manifests as exorcism and rituals. Similarly, if the cause of suffering is limited to the presence of disease, health practice manifests as curative medicine. I began to realize that effective health practices required an understanding of health that included the conditions for physical, mental, and social well-being, as stated in the WHO's definition of health. After working in Papua New Guinea, I started my postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford in 1991. I was hoping to include survivors of torture as one of my sample populations. I approached Survivors International of Northern California seeking a collaboration, but instead immediately became their medical director. Needless to say, I found a home at Survivors International working with extremely talented and committed clinicians and staff. Importantly, a component of my research included working with the Bay Area Oral History Project. Again, the Bay Area Holocaust Oral History Project, where I learned to conduct detailed interviews of trauma, recovery, and resilience, life histories that have been preserved for future generations at the Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. Those newly acquired interviewing skills became invaluable to me in my subsequent work with survivors of torture, and they kind of appear in the Istanbul Protocol as well. Well, as the medical director of Survivors International during the next 8 years, I witnessed and participated in a movement, your movement, that has literally changed the world for the better. When we started, we were a handful of volunteer clinicians with extremely limited resources. Our executive director literally worked out of a coat closet in one of our clinicians' offices. During my first year, I worked 1 day a week as an attending physician at the Stanford VA hospital to support 4 unpaid days a week at Survivors International. We started with what we knew, medical care and individual therapy, but quickly recognized that healing and social reintegration required much more. Within a few years, we established a job placement program, a food pantry, support groups, and an ESL program. We provided legal services, which included clinical evaluations of asylum applicants, This was a new frontier in those days. The immigration judges and asylum officers initially questioned our qualifications and were resistant to the evidence we presented, especially psychological evidence. We were frequently required to testify in immigration court proceedings, which ultimately worked in our favor. Over time, the adjudicators came to know us and rely on our clinical evaluations. Asylum approval rates increased from less than 10% to more than 90% in the Bay Area, ultimately enabling survivors to gain a distance from their perpetrators and an opportunity to rebuild their lives. Immigration judges and asylum officers requested trainings from us on clinical evaluations of asylum applicants. They also recognized their own vicarious trauma, and they requested training for mitigation strategies. Some years later, my colleagues and I were invited to train all immigration judges at the Executive Office for Immigration Reform here in Washington, D.C. Survivors International also facilitated the development of new treatment centers. For example, Bellevue NYU, Boston University, Emory University, and Survivors International in San Diego. Together with my dear friend, Jose Quiroga, we also helped to establish the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs. In the early 1990s, there were only 5 or 6 treatment centers in the United States, but that soon changed thanks to the brilliance of Doug Johnson, the executive director of the CVT, and John Salzberg, who worked as a lobbyist for the CVT. Doug recruited Dr. Alan Keller, my brother, and me to testify before Senate and House committees, and also Dr. Inga Ganefka, who was the director of the Rehabilitation and Research Center for Torture Victims, the RCT. It's now known as Dignity, Danish Institute Against Torture. These efforts culminated in the passing of the Torture Victims Relief Act in 1998. The Torture Victims Relief Act stated, "The American people abhor torture by any government or person. By acting to heal the survivors of torture and protect their families, the United States can help to heal the effects of torture and prevent its use around the world." It defined torture in the U.S. Criminal Code as an act committed by a person acting under the color of law specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental pain or suffering, other than pain or suffering incidental to lawful sanctions, upon another person within his custody or lawful control. The Torture Victims Relief Act was also authorized increased funding to the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture and a new funding stream to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The U.S. contribution to the UN Voluntary Fund increased tenfold from $500,000 annually to $5 million. And ORR was provided a budget of $20 million to establish and support treatment centers for survivors of torture throughout the United States. That's Inga on the left. The Torture Victims Relief Act was a watershed event. It facilitated the development of treatment centers around the world, including many NCTTP members. What started as a handful of centers in the early 1990s became a global movement. Currently, the IRCT's members include 176 independent, specialized rehabilitation centers in 80 countries. The NCTTP, according to the website, includes 38 members in 22 states. And in 2005, the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture provided 186 grants to centers in 92 countries, serving 56,000 survivors. The activities of these centers in turn strengthen global anti-torture activities, including the establishment of the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture and its subcommittee on prevention of torture. That's responsible for prevention, monitoring visits to states, and establishing and advising national preventative mechanisms for prevention monitoring as well. Currently, 95 states have ratified OPCAT, and 77 of them have established NPMs. We are immensely grateful to ORR and the staff of the Survivors of Torture program for their enduring support of survivors. I think we all understand that supporting survivors has enormous restorative value for individuals and communities and sends a message to the world that torture is unacceptable under all circumstances. But rehabilitation alone does not achieve the accountability, justice, and prevention necessary to end torture practices. Accountability, justice, and prevention require effective investigation and documentation. And that's just what I did for the next 27 years with Physicians for Human Rights. In 1992, just months after becoming the medical director of Survivors International, I attended a Physicians for Human Rights conference on medicine and human rights. Given my newly acquired skill of documenting clinical evidence of torture, there were only 3 others in the United States at the time. PHR asked me to participate in several human rights investigations there at the conference before I even had a chance to consider my potential role in documentation. The first investigation, just weeks after the PHR conference, involved investigating and documenting the excessive use of lethal force on and disappearances of pro-democracy demonstrators in Thailand. It was my great fortune to work with extremely capable and intrepid Human Rights Watch investigation experts, Sydney Jones in Thailand and Patricia Gossman in India. I learned that almost anything can happen during the first investigation. On the last day of that investigation in Thailand, Sydney and I delivered a baby in the taxi cab behind ours, stuck in horrific Bangkok traffic, in a suit and tie with no gloves. And not wanting to delay the trip to the hospital, the taxi driver continued driving throughout the delivery. You'll be happy to know I recently learned that the Thai police force now has a special unit of police midwives to deliver babies in Bangkok traffic. A few months later, Patty Gossman and I investigated torture, political killings, disappearances, rape, and attacks on health professionals and facilities in Punjab and in Kashmir, India. Kashmir was one of the most dangerous places on earth at the time. We were the only human rights organizations that managed to visit Kashmir and shine a light on systematic and widespread practices. We had some very tense encounters with Indian security forces during our visit, and unfortunately, 3 of our Kashmiri colleagues were murdered shortly after our departure. As a result of our investigation, the Indian government also banned me from ever returning to India. In those early years of treating survivors and documenting the health consequences of human rights violations, I began to understand that the realization of any one right, such as the freedom from torture, depended on the protection and promotion of other rights. In the case of torture, the rights of due process and protection against arbitrary arrest, freedom of speech, thought, conscience, religion, peaceful assembly and association, and the right to vote, to name a few. And as Patty and I passed through the slums of New Delhi, where some 2 to 3 million people were living without the basics for survival at that time, it was abundantly clear to me that unrealized human needs were just as important to individuals and communities as the civil and political rights violations that we had just documented. I came to understand what human rights advocates already knew, that human rights, civil and political, economic and social, are not only universal but interdependent and indivisible. The idea that human rights are essential conditions for health and well-being was at first a radical idea, even within PHR. It wasn't until 1993 at the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna that I encountered another person who had come up with the same conclusion, Dr. Jonathan Mann. Jonathan founded the World Health Organization's Global Program for AIDS and observed how health policies violated the rights of people with HIV/AIDS. In 1994, Jonathan established the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and started the Health and Human Rights Journal. In the first issue of the journal, he and several colleagues recognized 3 linkages between health and human rights. Human rights have health consequences, that I knew very well. Health policies create human rights burdens, and health and human rights are intrinsically related, meaning that rights are an end in and of themselves because they are the conditions for health and well-being, independent of their morbidity and mortality that human rights violations may cause. We both proceeded to teach courses on health and human rights and publish articles on the subject, but raising awareness of health and human rights concerns in schools of medicine and public health, that was an uphill battle. As you know, principles of medical ethics are codes of conduct that regulate clinical encounters with individual patients. They do not provide a formal definition of health, nor establish duties to protect and promote human rights. And despite the expansive and enlightened WHO definition of health, normative health practices largely consist of the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of diseases. Well, we started a Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley in 1993, and for the past 37 years, the center has contributed to a global health and human rights movement. We trained generations of health professionals and facilitated the development of new health and human rights centers. And PHR established student health and human rights chapters in dozens of schools of medicine and public health. These centers and the work of others such as Paul Farmer and Jim Kim, co-founders of Partners in Health, contributed to discourses on global health and the right to health that generated global awareness to the critical importance of economic and social rights as essential conditions of health. These health and human rights discourses ultimately had an impact within the United Nations. This was evident to me in 1998 when I had the honor of serving as a consultant to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson. We were asked to identify future directions in human rights. Our discussions focused on taking action to realize economic and social rights and addressing structural causes of global inequality. Mary Robinson subsequently played a pivotal role in shaping the Millennium Development Goals by passionately advocating for a human rights-based approach to global development. She also facilitated the development of the UN Global Compact. It's the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative, calling on companies to align strategies with 10 universal principles regarding human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Founded in 2000, it united over 20,000 companies in 160-plus countries to advance sustainable development goals. As I mentioned, in my 27 years of work with PHR, I participated in documenting the health consequences of a wide range of human rights violations, including genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture and ill treatment, including police brutality, family separation at the U.S. border, and excessive use of force in crowd control settings. The use of chemical weapons on civilian populations, war-related sexual violence, the health consequences of landmines, child labor practices, the effect of HIV/AIDS policies on human rights, and attacks on health professionals and facilities. We advocated for policy reforms based on our findings and international human rights and humanitarian law. We established international human rights norms to empower civil society and hold states accountable. And we multiplied the effect of our work through capacity building programs. We also organized action to support colleagues at risk. In 1997, PHR was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for our work on the international campaign to ban landmines, which culminated in a UN convention that banned the production, use, and distribution of landmines. A gratifying full circle for me, from the bedside of landmine victims on the Thai-Cambodian border to a complete ban on the cause of the suffering that I once helplessly witnessed. PHR's anti-torture work has evolved over the years. Initially, we conducted medical evaluations of individuals and advocated for accountability and justice on their behalf. Our anti-torture work was greatly enhanced, however, by the development of international norms for the effective investigation and documentation of torture and other forms of ill treatment, known as the Istanbul Protocol, or IP for short. We're going to discuss the IP in some detail, as it has served as the basis for PHR's anti-torture work and many other organizations, including investigations, capacity building efforts, development of training resources, large-scale implementation projects, and advocacy and policy reform efforts. Before I do that, I'd like to just ask people who here has heard of the Istanbul Protocol. Raise your hand. That's good. And who here has actually read it? All right, almost as many. And who here applies its guidance in their everyday work, legal or clinical? Great, thanks. That's helpful. Just to clarify, we will be referring to torture as defined by the UN Convention Against Torture, which can be summarized as the intentional infliction of severe physical and/or mental pain by or with the acquiescence of a public official for the purpose of interrogation, punishment, or any reason based on discrimination of any kind, and it excludes acts that are lawfully sanctioned by the state. Ill treatment, also known as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, differs from torture based on the severity of the treatment and the powerlessness of the victim, and it does not require a purpose. Importantly, while the U.S. has ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, its reservations render the convention as non-judicially enforceable in U.S. courts and excludes capital punishment. Unlike the UN Convention Against Torture, the World Medical Association's definition of torture is not limited to acts perpetrated by state officials for a specific purpose and does not exclude acts sanctioned by law. It simply states that torture is the deliberate, systematic, or wanton infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more persons acting alone or on the orders of an authority to force another person to yield information, to make a confession, or for any other reason. So what is the Istanbul Protocol? It's a series of UN guidelines for the effective investigation and documentation of torture and ill treatment. Guidance to ensure that states fulfill their treaty obligations to investigate, prosecute, and punish torture and other forms of ill treatment, and to prevent it as well. The development of the IP is a story worth telling. For me, it illustrates how friendship, common understanding, and action can empower us to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. In 1995, as the Western Regional Director of PHR, I investigated and documented the systematic and widespread practice of torture in Turkey. At that time, there was no standard by which to judge the quality and accuracy of medical legal evaluations. Consequently, in Turkey and in other countries, high-quality medical legal evaluations conducted by clinical experts in civil society were often excluded from judicial and administrative proceedings, while at the same time, inadequate and inaccurate state forensic evaluations were routinely admitted into evidence. We understood from our torture documentation experiences in Turkey that the failure of states to ensure effective forensic evidence of torture was deliberate and instrumental to states' denials of torture and the cycle of impunity that sustains it. However, the idea of creating international standards didn't occur to us until 1996 at an international conference in Adana, Turkey. During a lunch break, a small group of colleagues got together. Someone made a proposal for a research collaboration with our Turkish colleagues that I considered burdensome and unproductive, so I made a counter-proposal to develop international guidelines that would compel states to conduct proper investigations of torture and empower our friends in civil society with a framework to hold perpetrators accountable. And that we refer to our guidance as the Istanbul Protocol as a way of supporting and protecting our Turkish colleagues who worked under the constant threat of arrest and imprisonment, many who have been arrested and imprisoned. We modeled our efforts after the Minnesota Protocol on death investigations, and the first draft of the IP was based on 20 pages of documentation guidance that I had developed for the PHR investigation in Turkey. We were 75 experts from 15 countries working over a 3-year period. The IP was first published by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, in 2001 and contained 6 chapters and 4 annexes. The chapters included relevant legal standards, relevant ethical codes, legal investigations of torture, general interview considerations, physical evidence of torture, and psychological evidence of torture. Importantly, Annex 1 included 1.5 pages of Istanbul Protocol principles, both legal and clinical, that represented minimum standards for states, whereas the entire IP manual represented an elaboration of the IP principles. Between 2016 and 2022, I had the privilege of leading a large-scale effort to update the Istanbul Protocol. We will discuss this on Wednesday in our peer training session. Well, at the time, we had no idea that the IP would become a global standard for torture investigations, but really it was so sorely needed that it just flew on its own. Today, it is recognized by the United Nations, all of the UN anti-torture bodies, regional human rights bodies and courts, and in jurisprudence and federal law in some countries such as Mexico, Colombia, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, and Chile. And just last week in Morocco, I'm happy to say, The IP has been applied in a number of different ways, medical legal reports and in criminal, civil, and administrative cases such as asylum evaluations, human rights field investigations, international human rights monitoring, advocacy for torture accountability and prevention, capacity building trainings, and in large-scale IP implementation projects. IP medical legal evaluations have been instrumental in obtaining justice in individual criminal, civil, and administrative cases. Such evaluations have enabled the first ever torture convictions in countries where torture is widespread and systematic, and the exposure of clandestine torture regimes. And as you know, they are often critically important in the adjudication of asylum claims, even though the clinical evaluation may take place years after the alleged torture, as illustrated in this slide. The photo on the left shows the effects of torture with a heavy metal roller that I documented in Kashmir in 1992, just days after it occurred, while the photo on the right shows the late effects of the same method of torture, muscle atrophy and fibrosis, in a U.S. asylum evaluation that I conducted in 2001, years after the alleged abuse. During the past 35 years, PHR's asylum program has developed a network of pro bono volunteer clinicians who apply Istanbul Protocol guidance in their asylum evaluations. Currently, there are more than 2,000 volunteer clinicians who conduct more than 700 asylum evaluations annually. The asylum program has partnered with 20 medical schools that conduct asylum evaluations and offers in-person and online training. Just last week, I spoke to PHR staff about the challenges asylum evaluators are currently experiencing, which include clinicians being required to testify in person, increased scrutiny of clinician affidavits, increased challenges to clinician qualifications, the inability to access clients removed to other jurisdictions, and detention conditions adversely affecting the physical and mental health of asylum applicants. We will discuss these challenges and your experiences in greater detail in the peer training on Wednesday with Dr. Kate McKenzie and Dr. Colleen Kivlahan. We have applied the IP in large-scale population-based assessments of war crimes, including torture and sexual violence among displaced persons and refugees, and have documented prison conditions that constitute ill treatment and torture and the adverse mental health consequences of detaining U.S. asylum seekers. In some instances, PHR's anti-torture work has had a profound impact on policy. In 2004, PHR conducted a study of 18 juveniles on death row in Texas that demonstrated age-related impaired decision-making capabilities and significant mental health disorders. This study was heavily cited in the Supreme Court's 2005 ruling that affirmed executing individuals for crimes committed while under the age of 18 is unconstitutional. The ruling overturned death sentences for 72 individuals on death row in 12 states. In our efforts to hold the U.S. accountable for torture in its war on terror, we conducted IP evaluations among former national security detainees as well as Guantanamo detainees in federal habeas and military commission cases. We documented a policy of systematic torture in 3 theaters of operation that was aided and abetted by medical personnel in the Department of Defense and the CIA. The man on the right is Mohamedou Ould Salahi, who was tortured in Guantanamo and held without any charges for 14 years. He wrote the New York Times bestseller, Guantanamo Diary, and his story is featured in the movie The Mauritanian, which I highly recommend. I examined Mohamedou in Guantanamo and testified in his federal habeas case, which he won in 2010, but he wasn't released until 2016. His courage, resilience, and capacity for forgiveness are important lessons for humanity. I'm happy to report that Mohamedou now lives in Amsterdam and periodically guest lectures with me on the subject of torture in the Health and Human Rights course at UC Berkeley. PHR has applied Istanbul Protocol guidance in documenting torture and ill treatment in non-custodial settings. For example, the unnecessary and excessive force used against protesters in Turkey in 2013 after the Gezi Park protests, and in the context of U.S. protests in recent years. For more than 30 years, PHR has trained thousands of clinicians and legal experts in civil society and in human rights and state institutions to effectively investigate and document torture. Here are just a few examples of those we trained in civil society, often with partner organizations like the IRCT, U.S. asylum evaluators, UN anti-torture bodies, national preventive mechanisms, prosecutors at the International Criminal Court, forensic experts and judges in Chile adjudicating Pinochet cases recently, Ukraine prosecutors, Iranian clinicians documenting torture among protesters, and national human rights institutions. Sorry about that. We have trained generations of clinicians, and those generations have continued to the multiplier effect of training additional generations. We have developed a wide range of training materials, including a model curriculum, many country-specific training materials, and online training materials such as the Asylum Medicine Training Curriculum, which Dr. McKenzie will discuss in our peer training on Wednesday. Excuse me. In addition to capacity building for individual experts, we have undertaken large-scale, multi-year efforts to implement effective investigation and documentation practices of torture and ill treatment. 8 years in Mexico, 9 years in 3 Central Asian countries. These implementation projects envision a sea change across legal, judicial, health, and law enforcement sectors, and involved awareness raising, capacity building, legal, judicial, and administrative reform, as well as active engagement with civil society. The experience gained and lessons learned from these large-scale projects have served as a basis for the implementation guidance in Chapter 8 of the 2022 edition of the Istanbul Protocol, guidance that is critical in navigating the multitude of challenges that arise in working with states. To ensure the Istanbul Protocol is recognized in judicial proceedings, we have testified in critical legal cases, such as the UK Supreme Court case in 2019, the case of KV Sri Lanka versus Secretary of State for the Home Department, UK. The state challenged the authority of the Istanbul Protocol and asserted that opinions on the possibility of torture were beyond the remit of the medical expert. Dr. Juliet Cohen and I provided expert testimony on the probative value of the Istanbul Protocol, including the necessity of clinical opinions on the possibility of torture based on relevant clinical findings. The UK Supreme Court ultimately determined that the Istanbul Protocol should be given equal weight to existing guidelines in the UK. And medical experts can opine on the possibility of torture as causes of injuries as required by the Istanbul Protocol. The Istanbul Protocol is an integral component of the anti-torture activities of many other organizations such as the Independent Forensic Group. The Independent Forensic Group, or IFEG for short, was established by the IRCT in 2012 and currently consists of 42 forensic experts from 23 countries. These forensic experts apply Istanbul Protocol guidance in strategic litigation of criminal and civil torture cases and in developing timely consensus statements on practices that constitute torture and ill treatment, including hooding, virginity examinations, forced anal examinations of men, and conversion therapy. These IFEG statements have been instrumental in achieving justice in legal proceedings. For example, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights issued a decision recently calling upon Egypt to eradicate virginity testing, calling it degrading, inhuman, and torture, thanks in part to IFEG's statement on virginity. And lastly, the IP has had the additional effects of serving as a model for other human rights protocols, creating synergy between civil society and UN bodies and anti-torture mechanisms, helping to engage health professionals in human rights work, and strengthening the anti-torture community for coordinated action, including the protection of colleagues at risk. As in the case of my dear friend, Dr. Şebnem Korur Fincancı, the president of the Turkish Medical Association, who was imprisoned for simply commenting on video footage that indicated the possible use of a chemical gas agent by Turkish soldiers. Widespread international pressure aided in securing her release just after 15 days of serving a 2-year sentence. Şebnem is free currently, and appeal is pending. From my perspective, I believe that we have made significant and meaningful progress in our anti-torture work during the past 4 decades. Just a few months ago, a group of survivors, together with several NGOs, submitted to the United Nations their own charter articulating a global agenda for realizing survivor rights, including the right to live free from torture and ill treatment, to truth and accountability, to participate and to lead in anti-torture efforts, to a victim and survivor-centered approach in all actions, to justice, and to international solidarity and cooperation. But as you know, we continue to face extraordinary challenges in combating torture. Torture continues to be practiced in more than half the world's countries, and honestly, this isn't surprising when we consider the findings of world public opinion surveys. Overall support for torture of suspected terrorists in countries surveyed has risen from 30% in 2008 to 40% in 2015. And in the United States, from 36% in 2008 to 58% in 2015. The level of support for torture relative to other countries surveyed is highlighted in black, as illustrated in this graph. And this level of support for torture by U.S. citizens was measured after the 2014 Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report demonstrated that systematic torture in 3 theaters of operation in the U.S. war on terror provided no actionable intelligence. In fact, most people today are unaware that the U.S. went to war in Iraq in 2003 largely based on the false confession of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who reported weapons of mass destruction in Iraq only after being waterboarded. He soon recounted after that. Next. Well, if we are to address such support for torture, I think it's imperative for us to understand how mechanisms of moral disengagement facilitate torture and support thereof. Albert Bandura identified mechanisms of moral disengagement, as illustrated in this slide. People use moral justifications, palliative comparisons, and euphemistic labeling to enable reprehensible conduct. They minimize, ignore, and misconstrue the consequences of committing and supporting reprehensible acts. They blame the victim and displace and diffuse their responsibility for reprehensible conduct and its effects. Understanding moral disengagement as a choice can and should be used as a fulcrum for facilitating moral conduct. Well, during the past 40 years, I've had the honor of participating in 3 important movements: caring for survivors of torture, documenting human rights violations, and establishing a health and human rights discourse. In my view, torture provides a window into both our inhumanity and our humanity. It is one of many symptoms of human cruelty that manifest as acts of intentional harm and in the neglect of basic human needs. In our struggle to end torture and other forms of cruelty, we need to address not only the effects of torture among individuals and communities, but its causes. Our location matters. Collectively, we need to work upstream and downstream of the suffering we witness and aim to address. We need to recognize that human rights are not only entitlements of every human being, they are essential conditions for health and well-being. And it is our duty as health professionals to protect and promote the rights of all people. Not just some rights, all rights, because the realization of any one right depends on the realization of others. Rights are indivisible and should not be selectively endorsed. And as we undertake the protection and promotion of human rights, we need to understand the limitations of human rights discourse. Human rights law lacks robust, effective enforcement mechanisms. They are obligations of state actors and therefore often fail to hold powerful non-state actors accountable. And human rights interests are typically eclipsed by geopolitical, national security, and economic interests. Furthermore, the power of states has been increasingly undermined by the rise of authoritarianism that has weakened the rule of law and with it, representative governance. If we are to compel states to respect, protect, and fulfill their human rights obligations, we need to develop national and global constituencies for human rights, a culture of human rights that manifests in representative governance. I urge you to think big, be humble, and work in partnerships. Take care of yourselves and others in our common human rights struggle, and recognize that our efforts in bending the arc of the moral universe towards justice requires power and realizing human rights in small places. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. summed up the necessity of power in this way: Power properly understood is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. In human rights terms, I understand the necessity of power as the strength required to respect the rights and dignity of all people. And what do I mean by human rights in small places? It's something Eleanor Roosevelt referred to on the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was, as you may know, the driving force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." Meaning that the respect for human dignity is more than a matter of holding states accountable. It is a way of being in the world. Human rights in small places speaks to the duty that we all have to respect the dignity and worth of others in our everyday interactions. It requires us to transcend our inheritance of tribal behaviors with distinct in and out groups that manifest as inhuman acts towards the other. But as human beings, we also have the capacity to learn and choose, to evolve, as evidenced by the healers in this room and the existence of human rights. Ultimately, the challenge before us lies in the understanding that humanity is our tribe and that we all share the same home. The tiny pale blue dot that Voyager captured gracefully and poetically in 1990, 3.6 billion miles from our home. Thank you. Thank you. We do have time. We're at 13 minutes on the clock for some questions. Or points of discussion.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ben McVeigh. I'm the medical director at the Libertas Center for Human Rights. A quick question about your experience doing testimonies on IP exams. It seems like a lot of the premise of like the Istanbul Protocol is that doctors and medical providers have a lot of credibility in the eyes of the public, and it seems like in the past 5, 10, 15 years that credibility has been sort of slowly deteriorating in the public's eye. So I'm wondering if you've had different experiences or changes in your perception as an expert witness over the past, decade or so of your career.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's I think the credibility, if I'm not mistaken, is still there among adjudicators. If you're talking about the credibility of health professionals because of the U.S. war on terror and the involvement of health professionals, I'm not sure which you're referring to, the evaluations of individuals and the credibility associated with documentation. Was that the question?
I'm sort of referring to a more general sense of respect from the public. I think with COVID and the sort of reaction to COVID,
I see.
There's been sort of a slow erosion in the way that there's all looks at the medical profession in general.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true in part, and I think trust is earned by the diligence that we have in caring for people, and I think that there have been serious lapses. I'll start with the U.S. war on terror, the health professionals basically writing the plan and the execution for interrogation methods, reverse engineering seer tactics, and how much faith can you have in a profession that authorizes torture, aids and abets it in practice? And there's a long history of unethical practices in the United States, from Tuskegee through other unethical experimentation and so forth. I think physicians need to work hard, and other health professionals. Obviously, during COVID, that was a challenge for everyone, and I think the work of health professionals was very much influenced by overriding policies. I think we have a lot of work to do. I think in the much larger scale of health professionals being relevant, I think we have a role to play in advocating for the conditions that makes people healthy. And that's not just about diseases, right? That's about a fair living wage, right? So people aren't on the precipice of economic disaster and living out on the streets and so forth. It's the full range of human rights concerns that I believe we should be attending to. And we're still not there yet. We have a long way to go. It's not even in our ethical principles that we're concerned about this, but I think that's the future for us. Hi.
Thank you. I'm Yinka Kinchler-Smith. I was part of the PH work in Sierra Leone. And I guess I just want to thank you. Thank you, but at the same time, just express the frustration that I feel. You know, like my colleagues here, I've been doing work not only with people coming in, but recently a lot of work on death row and in death house, and documenting torture that's done here in the US, where people under the auspices of being called terrorists are being brought in and tortured here. And just how frustrating and how, I can't even find the words right now, it is to document using the Istanbul Protocol, the torture, and to write about it and present reports to courts that totally dismiss and go on to execute people.
Yeah.
It's just frustrating. But thank you, thank you, thank you so much
Thanks.
for your work.
Yeah, this is so important with respect to the torture of people, whether they or cruel treatment of immigrants, and the need to gain access and to document that, to bring about changes and public opinion, you know, for people to understand the truth. That's critically important. And people on death row, I just testified in a case, even though I'm supposed to be retired, on death row conditions in Oklahoma constituting CIDT, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, and torture. The practices there are just horrific. And so that's something that's not attended to well enough, but the mechanisms are there. You know, partnerships between legal actors and clinical actors, it just takes, you know, that synergy and critical cases to bring about some changes, as the one example that I gave about the change in the Supreme Court's ruling on the unconstitutionality of executing minors under 18. So it's a partnership that needs to continue.
So I think we're going to take any virtual questions that have come through, and then or are we done with time? Okay.
Yes,
Sorry.
thank you. There is one question, Fatim Jafar, at Deer, Michigan. Could you please clarify the major distinction between an affidavit and a foreign medical evaluation, and indicate whether they generally hold equivalent weight in a court of law?
Say again the difference between an affidavit and what? A medical legal report?
Forensic medical evaluation.
I just still didn't catch that. A medical evaluation. Yeah. So there really is no distinction. I think they're terms used to refer to the exact same thing. Even a medical legal report, our colleagues internationally use that report and call it an MLR. It is the expert witness testimony in written and or oral form that is presented in a medical legal setting. Criminal, civil, administrative, and so forth. So it's a matter of semantics, whether you call that work product of an expert witness, whether they are an expert in physical evidence of torture and ill treatment or psychological evidence. I don't think it's particularly helpful to say one is more helpful a term than the other. We often use the term affidavit because medical expert witness testimony is presented as an affidavit or witness testimony. So it's the same thing, unless I'm not catching the meaning of your question. And of course, all these references to the Istanbul Protocol is really, what we're conveying is that is the model for that evaluation and the witness testimony that is derived from it in written or oral form.
Thank you so much. The
Pleasure.
next question and comment is from Alan Keller. I will just read it. Thank you, my dear brother Vince, for your deep compassion, tireless efforts, and brilliance. The light you shine on the darker sides of our humanity is truly a beacon of hope. I first met you in 1990 at an ARC reunion at which I went rock climbing for the first time with you. I remember clutching onto you for dear life and have been holding on to you as a friend and a colleague for dear life ever since. My question is simple but complex. How do you sustain yourself?
Yeah. Thanks, Alan, my brother, who has had virtually the same exact experience that I conveyed today, and we have accomplished so much together. Sustain myself? It's the small wins from every survivor that I've come in contact with, whose life has changed for the better. It's in knowing that there's incremental change over time, and also knowing that this is the right thing to do. I mean, the place where we should concentrate our efforts to bring about a world that we can all be happy and proud of. And so what's sustained me is that sort of knowledge and experience and the absolute sustenance of colleagues, right? For me, it's a family. I've worked with so many people over so many years, and it's been, such a support for me. And then there's my universe at home, my family that I always went to, after reviewing hundreds of videos of chemical gas exposure in Syria and so forth. I had a place to go, a refuge, a place of support. And so it's a combination of all these things, being supported, having a community, and engaging in meaningful work. Thanks, everyone.
That was absolutely amazing, inspirational. Sometimes people will talk about, wow, what a hard act to follow. But I tend to look at it in a different way. And what an easy act to follow, because so much has been done. So much has been said. The education, the edification that you have brought to us. And I'm looking at this lifelong trajectory of work and like, oh my goodness, how can we even ever measure up to that sort of thing? But we don't have to be as brilliant, as accomplished, because we're part of the same field. This isn't a competition. This isn't something where we're measuring one or the other. We are part of this same family that Dr. Iacopino just spoke about. And I am so proud and so pleased with what you've shared with us today. I can't think of a better way to have gotten our day started. So thank you one more time, folks, and we please. So what we will do now is take a brief break, and if we could all be back here at 10:30, because we have more incredible things to share with you. Thank you so very much.